They say his name was whispered like a prayer in the slums and a death sentence in the boardrooms. Jay Young, the burgundy-clad ghost of the city, a man who didn't just own the streets, he owned the breath of everyone walking them. Beside him stood Kimberly, his bride-to-be, a woman whose grace was so sharp it could draw blood, a socialite queen who treated the world like her personal footstool. But that night, beneath the crystal arches of the Van-to-Black lounge, the power didn't shift because of a rival's bullet or a police raid. It shifted because of a wine glass, held by a waitress with a blacklisted past and a bank account that had hit rock bottom months ago. She didn't use a blade to stop the wedding of the century. She used her nose, her palate, and a single drop of vintage red. What she revealed in that reflection didn't just stop a toast, it dismantled a queen. The neon lights of the city didn't offer hope, they just highlighted the shadows where people like Jane Holland lived. Jane didn't look at the sky anymore, she looked at the clock. 6:58 p.m. In 2 minutes, if her heels weren't clicking across the marble of the Van-to-Black lounge, she was finished. And in this city, being finished meant disappearing. Jane smoothed her apron, her fingers trembling slightly as she remembered the life she used to have. The vineyards, the accolades, the title of the city's youngest master sommelier. All gone, buried under a frame job that had turned her name into poison. "You're late, Holland," the floor manager barked, his voice dripping with the grease of the kitchen. He was a man who enjoyed the fact that a genius was now scrubbing his tables. "Table 0, get out there." The kitchen went cold. The line cooks froze mid-sear. The clatter of pans died instantly. Table 0 wasn't just a table, it was a throne. "They're here?" Jane asked, a knot of old fear tightening in her chest. "Jay Young is here," the manager whispered, actually wiping sweat from his lip. "And he's bringing the bride. If you spill a drop, if you breathe too loud, I won't just fire you, I'll make sure nobody ever finds the pieces." Jane nodded, her face a mask of practiced service. She had grown up in the world of $10,000 bottles and silent authority. She knew the difference between a cork that was dry and a heart that was rotten. She just didn't have the status to say so anymore. "I've got it," Jane said quietly. She stepped onto the floor. The lounge was a cathedral of dark glass and predatory wealth. At exactly 7 p.m., the air seemed to exit the room as the heavy doors swung open. Jay Young entered first. He was a pillar of burgundy silk and quiet violence, a faint scar tracing a history of wars won. On his arm was Kimberly, draped in white lace that looked like a shroud. She wasn't just beautiful, she was a masterpiece of deception. As Jane watched from the shadows of the decanting station, her sommelier's instinct screamed. She didn't see a blushing bride. She saw the way Kimberly's eyes darted toward the vintage glasses, not with anticipation, but with the cold, calculated look of a chemist. The first 15 minutes were a gauntlet of cruelty. Kimberly sent back the appetizers for being too loud to chew. She snapped her fingers at Jane as if she were a ghost. Jay Young sat like a statue, watching the room with eyes that saw everything but felt nothing. Then came the toast. The grand anniversary vintage was poured. "Waitress," Kimberly's voice cut through the room like a razor. She held up her glass, the wine swirling against the light. "There's a film on this. It smells cheap. Did you try to swap the vintage for some gutter water, or are you just incompetent?" Jane froze. She had decanted the bottle herself. It was a flawless 1990 estate red. But as she looked at the glass in Kimberly's hand, she saw it. The legs of the wine weren't coating the glass, they were breaking. A structural anomaly, a microscopic residue that didn't belong in any vineyard.
Kimberly wasn't complaining about the wine. She was checking to see if the neurotoxin had settled. "I asked you a question, girl," Kimberly sneered, her eyes gleaming with a hidden, lethal hunger. Ja Young finally looked up, his blue eyes locked onto Jane's, cold enough to stop a heart. "Is the wine spoiled?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous hum. Jane looked at the glass, then at the man whose life was seconds away from ending. She knew that if she spoke, her life as she knew it was over, but if she didn't, a king was about to die. The Vantablack Lounge was a tomb of glass and velvet, a place where the air was filtered and the humanity was suppressed. Jane Holland moved through the shadows of the dining hall like a ghost, her presence marked only by the silent replacement of a water glass or the subtle adjustment of a silver butter knife. She had perfected the art of being invisible. In this world, to be seen was to be judged, and Jane had already been judged by the best in the business. 3 years ago, she had been the rising star of the viticulture world, a sommelier with a golden nose who could identify the soil pH of a vineyard from a single sip. Now she was just a number on a payroll, a girl with a blacklisted resume and a debt to a city that didn't forgive. The weight of her past felt heavier tonight. Every time she caught her reflection in the darkened windows, she saw the girl she used to be, the one who stood tall in sun-drenched Italian cellars before the framing scandal stripped her of her credentials and her dignity. Now she lived in a walk-up apartment where the heater rattled like a dying man, driven by the singular, desperate goal of not falling back into the gutter. "Table 0, Holland, move it," the manager, Miller, hissed into her ear. He didn't look at her, he looked at the heavy oak doors at the front of the lounge. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. It wasn't a loud change, it was the kind of atmospheric drop that precedes a massive storm. The chatter of the city's elite died down to a strained hum. The kitchen staff, usually a chaotic symphony of shouting and clattering steel, went deathly silent. Jane felt the hair on her arms stand up. She knew that feeling. Power was entering the room. Ja Young didn't walk into a room so much as he reclaimed it. He was tall, his silhouette sharp and predatory in a deep burgundy suit that seemed to soak up the dim light of the lounge. A faint scar cut through the edge of his jaw, a reminder that his authority wasn't just inherited, it was taken. He didn't look at the diners who were pretending not to stare. He looked through them as if they were nothing more than furniture. On his arm was Kimberly. She was the perfect contrast to his dark gravity, radiant in a white silk gown that clung to her like a second skin, her diamonds catching the light of the chandeliers and throwing cold sparks across the room. She looked like a queen, but Jane, watching from the service station, noticed the way her gaze lingered on the exit routes and the security detail. Kimberly wasn't enjoying a night out, she was scouting a battlefield. "Water, sparkling, room temperature," Kimberly snapped as they reached the table, not even glancing at Jane as she pulled out her own chair. Jane stepped forward, her movements fluid and mechanical. As she poured the water, she caught the scent of Kimberly's perfume, a heavy, cloying lily that masked something sharper, something chemical. Jane's internal sommelier, the part of her she tried to keep buried, twitched. That scent didn't belong on a bride, it belonged in a lab. Ja Young sat across from his fiancée, his expression unreadable, a neck tattoo peeking out from his collar like a coiled snake. He didn't speak, he didn't have to. His silence was a physical weight, pressing down on the staff until every movement felt clumsy and forced. Jane felt his eyes track her hands as she set the glasses down. It was a cold, analytical stare, the look of a man who was used to finding the flaw in everything. "The vintage," Ja Young said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that made the crystal on the table vibrate. "Bring it now." Jane nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs. She turned toward the cellar, her mind racing. She was supposed to be invisible. She was supposed to be a servant, but as she reached for the bottle of 1990 Estate Red, her fingers brushed the glass and she felt the strange, oily residue on the rim of the reserved glasses. It was a texture she hadn't felt in all her years of service. She looked back at the table. Kimberly was smiling, a beautiful, vacant expression that didn't reach her predatory eyes. Jae Young was waiting. The trap was set. The wine was ready.
and Jane Holland, the girl who had lost everything, was the only person in the room who realized the King of Chicago was about to take his last drink. The invisibility she had spent years cultivating was about to become her greatest weapon or her final shroud. The 1990 Estate Red breathed in the decanter, its bouquet swirling with notes of dark cherry, tobacco, and aged oak. To anyone else, it was merely an expensive drink, but to Jane, it was a living history. As she stood at the preparation station, her senses were heightened to a degree that felt like a curse. She could hear the rhythmic clinking of silverware against fine china and the low, predatory hum of conversation from table 0, but her focus remained entirely on the glass. She reached for the lead crystal stemware reserved for Jae Young. As her fingers brushed the rim, she didn't feel the familiar friction-free glide of polished glass. Instead, there was a drag. It was a microscopic resistance, a film so thin it was invisible to the naked eye under the amber glow of the lounge's chandeliers. To a standard waitress, it might have been a smudge from a dishwasher or a stray bit of lint. To a master sommelier, whose career had been built on the physics of fluid and the purity of vessels, it was a siren. Jane tilted the glass toward a hidden sliver of LED light beneath the bar. The wine's legs, the streaks of liquid that crawled down the side after a swirl, depended on surface tension and alcohol content. But on this glass, the light didn't reflect cleanly. It scattered. There was a hydrophobic coating on the interior, a chemical barrier that wouldn't just alter the taste, it was designed to carry something. A cold dread settled in Jane's stomach as she glanced back at the table. Kimberly was leaning in toward Jae Young, her white lace sleeve brushing his burgundy suit. She was laughing, a sound like wind chimes in a graveyard, but her hand was resting near her evening clutch. Jane watched as Kimberly's thumb traced the edge of a small silver-capped vial hidden within the folds of her silk napkin. The movement was practiced, tactical, the kind of sleight of hand Jane had seen in the underworld bars of her childhood, but never in a room this refined. The toast was coming. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, sensing the ritual about to take place. This wasn't just a dinner. It was a public declaration of a union between two of the city's most dangerous bloodlines. If Jae Young drank from that glass, the city wouldn't just lose its king, it would descend into a vacuum of violence that would swallow everyone, including a waitress with no protection and a name that was already mud. Jane looked at the manager, Miller, who was watching her with a frantic, sweating intensity. He gestured sharply for her to move. The bottle was decanted. The glasses were ready. Every second she hesitated was a second that drew suspicion. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of black cotton and starch. She thought of the streets outside, the cold rain, and the promise she had made to herself to never be the victim of someone else's play again. Her framing happened because she remained silent when she saw the first red flag in a high-stakes auction. She wouldn't make that mistake twice. Her expertise was the only thing she had left, and tonight, that expertise was telling her that the liquid about to be poured was a death sentence. "The wine, Jane," Miller hissed, his voice cracking with nerves. Jane took a deep breath, her nostrils flaring as she caught that sharp metallic scent again, the one masked by Kimberly's lily perfume. It was the scent of a neurotoxin stabilizer. She gripped the decanter, the weight of the glass feeling like a weapon in her hand. She stepped out from the shadows of the station, her heels clicking a steady, funeral rhythm on the marble.
She reached the table just as Jae Young raised a hand to signal the room. The guests fell into a vacuum of silence. Kimberly's smile was radiant, her eyes fixed on Jae Young's throat as if she were already imagining it closing up. Jane moved to Jae Young's right side, the glass in her left hand, the decanter in her right. She saw the microscopic film one last time, a shimmering trap waiting for its prey. As she lowered the glass to the table, her eyes met Jae Young's.
For a fraction of a second, the cold blue of his gaze seemed to pierce through her invisibility, demanding to know why a ghost was suddenly haunting his table. Jane didn't pour. She froze, the neck of the decanter hovering inches above the crystal. The red flags weren't just flapping, they were screaming. The silence in the Vanta Black lounge was no longer a social grace, it was a physical weight, pressing the oxygen out of the room. Jae Young's hand was already outstretched, his fingers inches from the stem of the tainted glass. Kimberly had transitioned from a smile to a look of rapt, predatory hunger, her body leaning forward as if to catch the very moment his heart stopped beating. "Don't drink that." The voice was quiet, but in the vacuum of the lounge it rang out like a gunshot. Jane didn't recognize it as her own at first. It was the voice of the woman she used to be, the expert who commanded rooms, the scientist who lived for the truth of the vine. Jae Young's hand froze. His head turned with the slow, terrifying precision of a predator acknowledging a new threat. The entire room seemed to pivot on its axis. Guests stopped mid-gesture, forks hovered over plates, and the manager, Miller, looked as though he were about to collapse into a heap of terrified silk. "What did you say?" Jae Young asked. His voice was a low, dangerous vibration that crawled up Jane's spine. Jane didn't back down. She didn't look at the floor. Instead, she reached out and took the glass before Jae Young could touch it. She held it up high, the crystal catching the overhead spotlights, until the wine inside glowed like a ruby. "The wine is a 1990 Estate Red, Mr. Jae Young," Jane said, her voice steadying as the adrenaline took hold. "It should have a specific viscosity. It should leave legs that move with the grace of silk. But look at the interior." She tilted the glass, and the elite of Chicago leaned in, drawn by the sheer audacity of a waitress lecturing a mafia king. Kimberly's face transformed in an instant. The bridal glow evaporated, replaced by a mask of cold, sharp-edged fury. "She's insane," Kimberly hissed, her hand clenching into a white-knuckled fist on the table. "Jay, she's a blacklisted failure trying to make a scene. Have her removed, now." "Look at the refraction," Jane continued, ignoring the woman who could have her killed with a nod. She pointed to where the light hit the film she had detected earlier. "There is a hydrophobic residue on the glass. It's a stabilizing agent for a liquid neurotoxin. Colorless, odorless, but it changes the surface tension of the crystal. If you drink this, your respiratory system will fail before you can finish the toast." Jae Young stood up. He was a head taller than Jane, a mountain of burgundy and suppressed violence. He didn't look at the glass. He looked into Jane's eyes, searching for a tremor, a lie, or a sign of a hidden agenda. He saw only the clinical, unwavering certainty of a woman who knew her craft better than she knew her own name. The silence deepened, turning brittle. Kimberly made a move to grab the glass, her movements frantic, but Jane stepped back, keeping the evidence in the light. "If I'm wrong," Jane said, her gaze locked onto Jae Young's, "you can execute me right here. But if I'm right, your bride just turned your engagement gala into a funeral." Jae Young reached out, his large hand wrapping around Jane's wrist. He didn't pull the glass away, he simply held her there, a living anchor in the middle of the storm. He turned his gaze to Kimberly, whose chest was heaving, the wide-eyed panic of a caught animal finally surfacing through the lace and diamonds.
"Kimberly," Jae Young said softly, a sound more terrifying than a scream. "The waitress says the wine is spoiled. Why are you shaking?" The room gasped as one. The power had shifted. The spotlight was no longer on the king or his bride, but on the invisible girl and the single glass of wine that had exposed a war. Jane stood her ground, the glass held high like a torch, watching as the world of the powerful began to crumble under the weight of a secret revealed in crystal. The tension in the van-to-black lounge had reached a point of no return. Every pair of eyes in the room was fixed on the single glass Jane held aloft, yet the atmosphere remained thick with skepticism. Kimberly's panic had sharpened into a desperate defensive venom. "Kimberly, are you really going to listen to a girl who pours water for a living?" Kimberly demanded, her voice rising to a frantic pitch. "She's a fraud. She's looking for a payout. This is an insult to our families, to the alliance we've built." Jae-young didn't answer her. His eyes remained locked on Jane, his grip on her wrist firm, but no longer restrictive. It was the grip of a man waiting for a miracle or a reason to kill. "You said you could prove it," he said, his voice a low, terrifying rasp. "In this room, words are cheap. Show me." Jane didn't hesitate. She knew that in the world of high-stakes chemistry and viticulture, the truth was often hidden in the simplest reactions. "I need a copper coin," she said, her voice echoing through the silent hall. "A pre-1982 penny, if anyone has one. High copper content." The request was so mundane, it caused a ripple of confusion among the tuxedoed guests. After a moment of stunned hesitation, an older man at a nearby table, a judge whose career Jae-young had likely bought years ago, fumbled in his pocket and slid a dull, tarnished penny across the tablecloth. Jane picked up the coin. She could feel Kimberly's gaze boring into the side of her head, a look of pure, murderous intent. Jane ignored it. She lowered the glass to the table and, with the precision of a surgeon, dipped the copper coin into the dark, ruby liquid. Most neurotoxins used in biological sabotage are heavy metal-based. They're designed to be undetectable to the human tongue, but they are incredibly reactive to copper. If this wine were pure, the coin would simply come out wet. She began to swirl the coin within the vintage red, the silver stem of the glass clinking softly against the table. The sound was like a ticking clock. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Jane watched the surface of the liquid, her heart a steady, rhythmic thrum in her chest. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was the arbiter of life and death. Slowly, Jane lifted the coin from the wine. A collective gasp swept through the lounge. The dull, brownish tarnish of the penny was gone. In its place, the copper had turned a sickly, iridescent silver gray, a metallic sheen that looked like oil on water. The chemical reaction was undeniable. The neurotoxin had bonded to the copper, plating the coin in a visible layer of poison. The silence that followed was deafening. The guests moved back from their tables as if the very air around the gala had become toxic. Kimberly's face went a ghostly, translucent white. She tried to speak, her lips moving in a silent, frantic prayer, but no sound came out. Jae-young released Jane's wrist. He picked up the coin, holding it between his thumb and forefinger. He studied the silver-gray coating with a chilling, detached focus. Then he looked at Kimberly. The cold blue of his eyes had turned into a frozen wasteland. "You said the vintage indeed is spoiled," he said, his voice so quiet it was more frightening than a shout. He turned the coin over in his hand, then looked back at Jane. For the first time, he didn't look at her as a servant or a ghost. He looked at her as an equal, a woman who had just used a common penny to bring a queen to her knees.
"Miller," Jae-young said, not looking away from Jane. The manager scrambled forward, nearly tripping over his own feet. "Yes, Mr. Jae-young. Anything." "Clear the room," Jae-young commanded, "and tell the kitchen to prepare a fresh table in my private office. Miss Holland is no longer on the clock." As the security detail began to funnel the stunned guests toward the exits and Kimberly was led away in a state of catatonic shock, Jane felt the weight of the evening finally hit her. She was still holding the decanter, her hands finally starting to shake. She had survived the exposure, but she knew that by proving the poison's presence, she hadn't just saved a life. She had entered a world where the wine was always tainted,
and the price of the truth was often paid in blood. The chaos of the dining hall vanished behind the heavy, soundproof doors of Jae Young's private elevator. The transition from the public gaze to the intimate silence of his inner sanctum was jarring. Jane stood in the corner of the lift, still clutching her service notepad, her knuckles white. Jae Young stood with his back to her, his reflection in the polished brass panels showing a man who had just watched his future go up in flames, yet his breathing remained slow and rhythmic. They didn't stop at the lobby. The elevator descended past the ground floor, into the bowels of the building where the air turned cool and filtered. When the doors slid open, they stepped into the Vaughn, a high-tech safe house that looked less like a bunker and more like a fortress of minimalist glass and dark steel. It was a space designed for two things: survival and secrets. Jae Young shed his burgundy suit jacket, tossing it onto a leather sofa as he walked toward a wall of monitors that flickered with live feeds of the city's shipping docks and financial centers. He didn't offer her a seat. He simply turned, leaning against a steel desk, and studied her with the same intensity he might use on a ledger of debts. "Do you know why I didn't let my men take you to the police as a witness?" he asked. The quiet of the room made his voice feel like a physical touch. "Because the police can't protect me from what happens next, and because you don't trust the police to handle Kimberly's family." Jae Young's lips thinned into the ghost of a smirk. "Astute, but there's another reason. I don't like anomalies, Jane Holland. And a waitress with the chemical expertise of a forensics expert and the palate of a master sommelier is a very loud anomaly." Jane felt a cold shiver. "I was just doing my job." "Your job was to pour the wine and keep your head down. Instead, you performed a qualitative analysis with a penny," he said, stepping closer. The light of the monitors cast a blue hue over his scarred jaw. "I did a background check on the way down. It took my analysts exactly 4 minutes to find the ghost of the girl you used to be. The sommelier who was accused of tainting a $3 million cellar to spite a rival. The girl who was blacklisted by every reputable house in Europe and North America." Jane's breath hitched. The trauma of the framing, the shame that had driven her into the shadows of the Van to Black lounge, felt like it was being dragged into the light. "I didn't do it. I was a scapegoat for a syndicate that needed a fall girl." "I know," Jae Young said. The simplicity of his statement stopped the air in her lungs. "The man who framed you was a subsidiary of the Duca family, the same family Kimberly belongs to. They didn't just want you gone, they wanted to control the market by removing the one person who could taste their synthetic additives. They've been playing a long game, Jane. They destroyed your life 3 years ago as a rehearsal for what they tried to do to me tonight." The realization hit Jane like a physical blow. Her misery hadn't been an accident, it had been a tactical maneuver. She wasn't just a waitress who happened to be there, she was a victim of the same enemy he was currently at war with. Jae Young walked to a glass cabinet and pulled out 2 clean tumblers. He didn't pour wine, he poured a dark amber whiskey. "You want your life back," he stated, not asking. "You want the name Jane Holland to mean something again. You want to see the people who put you in that apron burn." He held out a glass to her. "I need eyes that see what my soldiers miss. I need a nose that can smell a betrayal before it happens. You saved my life tonight, but that was free. From this moment on, you work for me. I clear your debt, I erase the blacklist, and I give you the resources to hunt the people who broke you." Jane looked at the whiskey, then at the man offering her a path out of the dark. It was a devil's bargain, exchanging the safety of her invisibility for the lethal spotlight of the Mafia's inner circle. But as she looked at Jae Young, she realized that for the first time in years, she wasn't being looked at as a servant. She was being looked at as a weapon. "What happens if I say no?" she asked. "Then you walk out that door, and the Ducas will find you before you reach the subway. You're a witness now, Jane. There is no going back to being invisible." Jane reached out and took the glass. The amber liquid caught the light, steady in her hand. She didn't hesitate. She drank it back, the burn of the alcohol matching the fire starting to simmer in her chest. "When do we start?" she asked. Jae-young finally smiled, a sharp, dangerous expression. "We already have." The transition from the service floor to the command center was a descent into a world of digital shadows and cold data. In the heart of the Vaughn, Jane sat before a curved array of monitors that cast a pale, flickering light over her features. She had traded her stained apron for a crisp silk blouse, but she still felt the ghost of the Vanta Black lounge clinging to her skin. Jae-young stood behind her, a silent, burgundy-clad sentinel, watching as she navigated the complex web of the Moretti family's logistics. To a standard auditor, these spreadsheets were a boring litany of shipping weights, port fees, and transit times. But Jane didn't look at numbers. She looked at the terroir, the trade. She treated the supply chain like a vintage wine, searching for the subtle imbalances that suggested the soil had been tampered with. Her fingers danced across the keyboard, pulling up the manifests for the Mediterranean imports, the olive oils, the fine linens, and the specialty glassware that formed the backbone of Jae-young's legitimate holdings. "Show me the temperature logs for the last 6 months of the Sicilian shipments," Jane murmured, her eyes narrowing as she scrolled. Jae-young tapped a command on the auxiliary screen. "Why? Those are climate-controlled containers. They're automated." "Exactly. In wine, temperature is everything. If a cellar fluctuates by even 2 degrees, the fermentation changes. It leaves a bitter note, a chemical signature of stress." She pointed to a specific line of data. "Look at Section G of the North Pier. The olive oil shipments are logged at a constant 4 degrees Celsius. That's too cold for oil. It would cloud and solidify. But it's the perfect temperature for maintaining the stability of organic tissue and high-grade chemical precursors." She felt Jae-young's presence sharpen. He leaned in, his hand resting on the back of her chair. The scent of his expensive tobacco and the cold metallic tang of the safe house filled her senses. "You're saying they're using my climate-controlled olive oil containers to move something else?" "I'm saying the nose of this manifest is off," Jane said, her voice growing more confident. "The weight of the pallets is off by exactly 12 kilograms per unit. That's the weight of a standard medical-grade cooling canister." She began cross-referencing the port signatures with the names of the inspectors who had cleared the cargo. One name appeared like a recurring metallic taste in a bad bottle. Henderson. Not the manager from the restaurant, but his cousin, a senior customs official with a gambling debt that had vanished 3 weeks ago. The pattern was unmistakable. The Dukas hadn't just planted Kimberly in Jae-young's bed. They had hollowed out his infrastructure from the inside, using his own reputation for gentlemanly business as a shield. They were moving more than just toxins. They were using his roots to traffic a new synthetic narcotic, a bitter note of corruption that was being cut with the same neurotoxin stabilizers she had found in the wine glass.
"They aren't just trying to kill you, Jae-young," Jane whispered, her eyes reflecting the scrolling green code. "They're trying to replace you. They're building a shadow empire using your bricks." Jae-young straightened, his jaw tight. The silence in the Vaughn was heavy, charged with the kind of electricity that precedes a lightning strike. He looked down at Jane, and for the first time, the coldness in his blue eyes was tempered by a grim respect. She wasn't just a taster anymore, she was a navigator. "I've spent millions on security experts who told me everything was fine," Jae-young said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "And a waitress with a grudge finds the rot in 20 minutes. "I told you," Jane said, finally turning to meet his gaze. "I have a very good nose for things that don't belong." "Then keep sniffing," Jae-young commanded, his hand moving to her shoulder in a gesture that was half possession, half partnership. "Because if this is the soil they've planted, I want to see how high the fire burns when we set it alight." Jane turned back to the screen. The fear that had defined her life for 3 years was gone, replaced by the clinical, cold satisfaction of a professional who had finally found the thread. The hunt was no longer about survival. It was about the vintage of revenge, and she was going to make sure the Dukas drank every last drop.
The tires of the armored sedan hissed against the flooded asphalt as they tore away from the Vaughn's hidden exit. Outside, Chicago was drowning in a relentless gray downpour that turned the neon signs of the loop into bleeding smears of light. Inside the car, the air was thick with the scent of leather and the ozone of high-end electronics. Jae Young sat behind the wheel, his hands relaxed but firm on the steering grip, while Jane monitored the tablet integrated into the dashboard. The data she had uncovered in the safe house was a flare sent into the night, and the Dukas had clearly seen it. 3 black SUVs, Jane said, her voice a calm, clinical contrast to the roar of the engine. They aren't trying to follow Jae Young, they're closing the gap. Jae Young glanced at the rearview mirror, his blue eyes turning to flint. The North Pier manifests. They know we found the Section G anomaly. He floored the accelerator. The car surged forward, pinning Jane back against the seat. Behind them, the pursuing vehicles swerved through traffic with reckless aggression, their headlights flashing like predatory eyes in the gloom. A sudden metallic thud echoed through the chassis. The first bullet had found its mark, glancing off the reinforced trunk. "They have high-caliber rounds," Jae Young muttered, his jaw tightening. He took a sharp turn onto a narrow side street, the sedan drifting dangerously close to a row of parked cars. "I can't lose them in the open. I need an edge." Jane didn't panic. Her mind, honed by years of analyzing the complex structural integrity of vintage wine, shifted into a different kind of calculation. She wasn't looking at the cars, she was looking at the environment. She swiped through the city's live infrastructure feed, her fingers moving with the same precision she used when decanting a brittle cork. "The Walker Drive lower level," Jane said, pointing to the map. "There's a maintenance gate at the 14th Street junction. It's narrow, too narrow for their SUVs, but we have 4 inches of clearance on either side." "If I hit that gate at 60, we lose the mirrors and maybe the doors," Jae Young replied, his voice a low growl. "You won't hit it," Jane said, looking him dead in the eye. "The rain has decreased the friction coefficient on the bridge plates. If you brake 3 seconds before the turn and use the slide, the car's tail will clear the pillar. It's like aerating a heavy red. You have to let it breathe into the space."
Jae Young didn't question her. He trusted her nose for a win. He swung the heavy sedan back onto the main thoroughfare, the engine screaming as he pushed it to the limit. The SUVs were flanking them now, trying to box them in. Another round of gunfire shattered the rear window's outer layer, spiderwebbing the glass into 1,000 crystalline fractures. "Now!" Jane commanded. Jae Young slammed the brakes, the car's rear end swinging out in a perfect, controlled skid. The sedan danced across the slick metal plates of the bridge, the tires screaming in protest. With a sickening scrape of metal on concrete, they shot through the maintenance gap. Behind them, the lead SUV, unable to match the delicate physics of the maneuver, slammed headfirst into the reinforced concrete pillar. The resulting explosion lit up the rain-slicked street in a violent burst of orange and black. The 2 remaining vehicles were forced to veer off, trapped on the upper level, while Jae Young and Jane disappeared into the dark, subterranean tunnels of the lower docks. Jae Young slowed the car as they reached the shadows of an abandoned warehouse district. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the ticking of the cooling engine and the steady drum of rain on the roof. He turned to look at Jane. Her hair had come loose from its severe bun, a few dark strands clinging to her damp forehead, but her expression remained focused, her eyes still fixed on the tablet. He reached out, his hand hovering near her shoulder before he pulled it back, settling for a sharp, appreciative nod. "You're a hell of a navigator, Jane Holland," he said, the tension in his voice finally giving way to a grim sort of wonder. "I told you," Jane replied, finally letting out a breath she felt she'd been holding since the Vantablack lounge. "I don't like it when things are out of balance, especially when someone is trying to spoil the vintage." As they sat in the darkness, the heat from the chase slowly fading, Jane realized the adrenaline hadn't just kept her alive, it had awakened something. She wasn't just surviving the Mafia's war anymore, she was winning it.
The adrenaline from the chase still hummed in Jane's veins, but as they retreated into the sterile, quiet depths of the Vaughn, it was replaced by a cold, analytical focus. Jae Young stood by the reinforced steel door, his burgundy shirt sleeves rolled up, revealing the intricate ink that spiraled down his forearms. He was a man of action, but even he looked unsettled. The ambush on Wacker Drive hadn't been a coincidence, it was a surgical strike. "They knew exactly which exit we used," Jae Young said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly whisper. "Only 4 people in my inner circle have the bypass codes for the Vaughn's garage. Someone I trust sold us out to the Dukas." He paced the length of the room, his presence making the air feel thick and heavy. He looked at his security detail, men who had bled for him for a decade, with a new, piercing suspicion. But Jane wasn't looking at the men. She was standing by the air filtration vent, her eyes closed, her nostrils flaring slightly. "It's not just about codes, Jae Young," Jane said softly. "Information has a signature, just like wine." She walked toward the center of the command hub, where the senior lieutenants stood, their faces grim. As she passed them, she didn't look for shifts in their posture or sweat on their brows. She was hunting for something far more subtle. To the world, the safe house smelled of ozone, gun oil, and expensive espresso. But to Jane, it was a complex bouquet of notes, and one of them was out of place. She stopped 3 feet away from Marcus, Jae Young's head of security. He was a mountain of a man, scarred and silent, the personification of loyalty. Jane moved past him, then pivoted toward a younger man named Leo, the technical specialist who had been monitoring the feeds. "The air in here is recycled every 10 minutes, but some things cling to the skin. They seep into the fabric of a suit." She stepped closer to Leo. He shifted uncomfortably, a bead of sweat tracing the line of his temple. "What are you doing, Waitress?" he muttered, trying to maintain a sneer that didn't quite reach his eyes. Jane didn't answer. She leaned in, her nose inches from his lapel. She caught the scent, a sharp, synthetic floral note with a metallic undertone. It was faint, nearly drowned out by the smell of server heat and coffee, but it was unmistakable.
"Lily," Jane whispered, "but not the kind that grows in a garden. It's lilial, a specific aldehyde used as a stabilizer in high-end French cosmetics, specifically the brand Kimberly wears." The room went deathly still. Jae Young moved with the speed of a striking viper, his hand closing around Leo's throat before the younger man could even flinch. He slammed him against the glass-topped desk, the monitors behind them flickering with the data of the very ambush Leo had helped coordinate. "She's lying," Leo gasped, his face turning a mottled purple. "She's a sommelier, Jay. She's making things up." "Jane doesn't make things up," Jae Young growled, his face inches from Leo's. "She has a nose for rot, and right now you smell like Kimberly's perfume. Why were you close enough to her to catch the scent, Leo? She's been in the holding cell for 3 hours. Jane stepped forward, her voice calm and clinical. "It's not just the perfume, it's the stabilizer, the same one I found in the wine glass. It's used in the manufacturing of the neurotoxin Kimberly's family is moving through Section G. You didn't just meet with her, you helped her prep the vials before the gala. The scent is embedded in your pores." Jae Young didn't need to hear anything else. He signaled to Marcus, who stepped forward with a pair of heavy restraints. Leo's bravado collapsed into a pathetic whimpering confession as he realized that a waitress's sense of smell had done what a dozen polygraph tests could not. As they dragged Leo out of the hub, Jae Young turned back to Jane. He looked at her with an expression that was no longer just respect, it was awe. She was standing there, calm and composed, the woman who had used a wine glass to expose a bride and a scent to catch a traitor. "You're more than a taster, Jane," Jae Young said, walking toward her until he was close enough for her to smell the dark, clean scent of his own cologne, sandalwood and iron. "You're the only person in this city who actually sees the world as it is." "I just know how to read the notes," Jane replied, though her heart was still thumping from the confrontation.
and right now the song is leading us straight to the source." Jae Young nodded, his hand resting briefly on her arm, a silent promise of protection. "Then let's go. If the scent of treachery is this strong here, I can only imagine what the vineyard smells like." The map Jane had reconstructed from the Section G shipping manifests led them 2 hours north of the city, where the urban decay of Chicago gave way to the rolling, mist-shrouded hills of the valley. As the sedan wound up the gravel driveway of the Grand Cru estate, it looked like a postcard of old-world elegance. A sprawling limestone villa sat perched above acres of meticulously manicured vines, their leaves turning a deep, bruised purple in the moonlight. To any passing traveler, it was a sanctuary of heritage and fine wine. To Jane, it was a crime scene waiting to be read. Jae Young moved with a silent, predatory grace, his hand resting on the holster beneath his burgundy coat. He followed Jane as she bypassed the main villa, heading instead for the fermentation cellar, a massive, half-buried stone structure that hummed with the sound of industrial refrigeration. "The soil here is wrong," Jae Young whispered as they reached the perimeter. She knelt, pressing her fingers into the earth beneath a row of Cabernet vines. "Look at the leaves. They're stunted, yellowing at the edges. This isn't from poor drainage, it's chemical runoff." She stood up and moved toward the cellar's ventilation shafts. Instead of the sweet, earthy scent of fermenting grapes and oak, a sharp, clinical odor drifted from the vents. It was the same bitter note she had detected in the Von Row, but here it was concentrated, overwhelming the natural aroma of the land. "They aren't making wine here," Jae Young said, her voice tight with a mix of professional outrage and mounting dread. "They're using the fermentation process as a thermal mask." Jae Young signaled to his men to hold the perimeter as he and Jane slipped through a side service door. The interior was a cavernous space filled with towering stainless steel vats. But as they moved deeper into the shadows, the traditional equipment gave way to something far more sinister. Behind a false wall of oak barrels lay a state-of-the-art laboratory that glowed with a sterile blue light.
Instead of wine, the vats were filled with a viscous, translucent fluid. Centrifuges whirred in the corners, and racks of glass vials, the same ones Kimberly had used at the gala, were being packed into specialized cooling canisters. Jane walked to a workstation covered in chemical journals and discarded test tubes. She picked up a manifest sitting on the desk. "This is it," she breathed, her eyes scanning the complex formulas. "They're using the natural acidity of the grape must to stabilize a synthetic neurotoxin. It's a biological weapon, Yao Young. They aren't just selling drugs, they're creating a weaponized compound that can be distributed through liquid, wine, water, even the city's reservoirs." Yao Young looked at the rows of vials, his expression hardening into a mask of pure iron. The scale of the Duca family's ambition was far beyond a simple territory grab. They were preparing to hold the entire region hostage, and they had been using his own logistics to move the components. "The Grand Cru isn't a vineyard," Yao Young said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that echoed off the steel vats. "It's a factory for mass murder." Jane felt a wave of nausea. She thought of the legs of the wine in the glass at the Vantablack Lounge, the way the light had scattered off the film. It hadn't just been a plot to kill one man. It was a pilot test for a global nightmare. Her framing years ago hadn't just been about a rival sommelier. It was because she had seen the early prototypes of this very compound in a Duca-owned cellar and didn't know what she was looking at. "We have to burn it," Jane said, her gaze meeting Yao Young's. "Not just the lab, the whole estate. The soil is poisoned, the vines are tainted, and if one of these canisters leaves this hill, it's over." Yao Young reached out, his hand finding the nape of her neck in a gesture that was both grounding and a call to arms. "We'll do more than burn it, Jane. We're going to show them that when you poison the king's wine, the king poisons your entire world." A sudden alarm began to blare, the sound echoing like a dying animal through the vast stone cellar. Red lights began to pulse against the stainless steel vats. The secret was out, and the creators of the Grand Crew were coming to protect their harvest. Jane gripped the manifest to her chest, her fear replaced by a cold, searing clarity. The vintage of revenge was finally ready to be served. The sirens screaming through the stone corridors of the Grand Crew were not just an alarm, they were the sound of a closing trap. Heavy steel shutters slammed down over the laboratory's exits with a thunderous finality, sealing the blue-lit room into a tomb. From the observation deck above, a group of armed guards appeared, their shadows stretching long and jagged across the stainless steel vats. "They aren't going to shoot," Yao Young said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal hum. He pulled Jane behind the curvature of a massive primary fermenter, his body a shield of burgundy silk. "They can't risk a stray round hitting those canisters. They'll wait for the air to be cut, then move in to finish us when we're too weak to fight." Jane looked up. The ventilation fans were slowing, the hum of the climate control dying into a terrifying silence. She could see the guards above donning tactical respirators. They weren't just sealing them in, they were letting the natural process of the cellar do the work. "The fermentation," Jane whispered, her mind racing through the chemistry of the room. "Yao Young, this cellar is filled with active vats. When grapes ferment, they produce massive amounts of carbon dioxide. Usually it's vented out. If those vents are closed, this room will be a death trap in 10 minutes.
"Can we use it?" Jae Young asked, his eyes scanning the catwalks for an opening. Jane looked at the pressure gauges on the side of the 5,000-liter stainless steel tank they were huddling behind. It was mid-fermentation, a violent, bubbling soup of sugar turning to alcohol. "CO2 is heavier than air," she explained, her fingers flying over the manual override valves at the base of the tank. "It sinks, it's invisible, odorless, and it displaces oxygen. If I release the gas from the bottom of these tanks, we can create a floor-level fog of suffocation, but we have to stay above it." "And the guards?" "They're on the catwalks," Jane said, pointing to the metal grates 10 feet above the floor. "But the exit is through the maintenance tunnel at the bottom of the far wall. We have to make them come down to us." Jae Young nodded, his face a mask of grim determination. "Do it." Jane gripped the heavy brass wheel of the fermentation vat. She knew the physics. The pressure inside was immense. If she opened it too fast, the liquid would drown them. If she opened it too slow, the gas wouldn't concentrate. She turned the wheel with a sharp, calculated jerk. A hiss, like 1,000 vipers, erupted from the valve. A cold, invisible wave of carbon dioxide began to pour out, pooling on the stone floor. Jane moved to the next tank, then the next, her knowledge of cellar management becoming a tactical weapon. She wasn't just a sommelier anymore. She was a goddess of the harvest, turning the bounty of the earth into a suffocating shroud. The guards above saw the movement and began to descend the spiral stairs, their silenced weapons raised. They stepped into what they thought was a clear room, but within 3 paces, the first man staggered. He dropped his rifle, his hands clawing at his throat as his lungs burned for oxygen that wasn't there. The second man collapsed behind him, his body hitting the floor with a heavy thud as he fell into the thickest part of the invisible cloud. "Now," Jane choked out, the air at her own chest level beginning to thin. Jae Young grabbed her, lifting her nearly off her feet as they scrambled toward the maintenance tunnel. The guards on the catwalks were shouting, but they couldn't see their targets through the shimmering distortion of the concentrated gas. Jae Young fired a single shot, not at the men, but at a fire suppression canister on the wall. The white powder erupted, mixing with the CO2 to create a literal smoke screen. They burst through the maintenance hatch, Jane gasping as the cool, oxygen-rich night air hit her lungs. They were outside, at the base of the hill, the limestone villa looming above them like a ghost. Jae Young turned to her, his chest heaving, his blue eyes alight with a fierce, terrifying respect. He reached out, his hand steadying her as she leaned against the stone wall. "You used the wine to kill them," he said, a dark smile touching his lips. "I used the science," she corrected, her voice returning with a sharp, vengeful edge. "They thought they could use this land to brew poison. I just reminded them that the vine defends its own." Jae-young gripped the heavy detonator from the pocket of Section G anomaly. "Then let's finish the harvest." With a single thumb press, the Grand Cru exploded. The orange fireball lit up the valley, turning the midnight sky into the color of a bruised Cabernet. The laboratory, the biological weapons, and the Duca's legacy were consumed in a roar of heat. As the glass shattered and the stone crumbled, Jane stood beside the Mafia King, no longer a waitress, but the architect of the fire.
The fire from the Grand Cru explosion painted the horizon in jagged streaks of crimson and gold. But as Jae-young and Jane reached the secondary docking bay at the edge of the estate, the air turned deathly cold. Standing in the center of the concrete pad, framed by the skeletal remains of an old bottling line, was Kimberly. The white silk of her gown was scorched at the hem, and her hair had come undone, but her eyes were shards of black glass. She wasn't running, she was waiting. In her hand, she held a single slender vial, not clear like the others, but a deep, viscous purple that shimmered with an unnatural light. "You think a little fire changes the ending?" Kimberly's voice was a jagged edge. She looked at Jane with a hatred so pure it felt like a physical heat. "This is the final vintage, Jane, a concentrated neurotoxin that doesn't need a glass. One drop on the skin and the heart simply forgets how to beat." Jae-young stepped forward, his hand moving toward his weapon, but Kimberly raised the vial high over a pressurized ventilation intake that led directly into the city's underground water conduit. "One more step, Jay, and I drop it. I might lose the war, but I'll turn your city into a graveyard before I leave." Jane felt the familiar hum of her sommelier's intuition. She looked at the vial, then at the way Kimberly was holding it, with the delicate, fearful grip of someone who knew the substance was unstable. Jane's mind raced through the chemical journals she had memorized in the Vaughn. "It's a beautiful color, Kimberly," Jane said, her voice eerily calm as she stepped out from behind Jae-young. "The deep purple of a late-harvest Malbec. But you've made a mistake in the stabilization. I can smell the esters from here." "You sneered," her hand trembling slightly. "You can't smell it through the glass, you arrogant waitress." "I don't need to smell it through the glass," Jane replied, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. "I can see the separation. The toxin is heavy metal-based, just like the one in the wine glass. But look at the surface tension. It's reacting with the oxygen in the vial's headspace. It's already inert." Kimberly's eyes flickered to the vial. "You're lying." "Am I?" Jane's voice was a soothing, clinical purr. "The heat from the explosion triggered a premature oxidation. It's a common flaw in synthetic peptides when they aren't kept at 4 degrees. You aren't holding a weapon anymore, Kimberly. You're holding colored water. If you don't believe me, look at the meniscus. It's concave. That only happens when the bond breaks." For a fraction of a second, Kimberly's predatory confidence wavered. Her gaze dropped to the vial, her thumb loosening as she checked the curve of the liquid against the light, a reflex Jane had spent years perfecting in student wine tasters. "If it's inert," hissed Kimberly, "then I have nothing to lose by testing it on you." She lunged, not toward the vent, but toward Jane, uncapping the vial with a frantic twist. But in her haste to prove Jane wrong, she had forgotten the one rule of the lab: never open a pressurized vessel without a vent. The liquid didn't pour, it sprayed, catching Kimberly's own gloveless palm. Kimberly laughed, a manic, triumphant sound. "You see? I'm fine. You were lying, you little—" She stopped. The laughter died in her throat.
She looked down at her hand. A faint silver-gray tarnish was spreading across her skin, the exact same iridescent sheen Jane had produced on the copper penny at the gala. "I lied about it being inert," Jane said, her voice dropping to a cold, final whisper. "I just needed you to open the seal so the reaction could start. You were so busy playing the queen that you forgot that every vintage has a tell, and yours just gave you away." The realization hit Kimberly a second before the toxin did. The final vintage wasn't a threat to the city anymore. It was a private execution. As the silver tarnish raced up her arm, her knees buckled. She reached for the vent, for Jae Young, for anything to take with her, but her muscles had already turned to stone.
Jae Young stepped forward, catching the empty vial before it could hit the ground, his eyes fixed on Jane with a mixture of terror and absolute devotion. Kimberly slumped against the concrete, the life fading from her eyes as the Queen of the Dukas became a permanent statue in the ruins of her own empire. Jane stood over her, the smell of rain and smoke finally beginning to clear the air. She didn't feel the triumph she expected. She felt the quiet, cold satisfaction of a professional who had finally balanced the books. The vintage was finished. The war was over. And for the first time in 3 years, Jane Holland could breathe. The heavy, iron-scented air of the valley was eventually replaced by the sterile, expensive scent of the Vanta Black Lounge as top-floor executive suite. Sunlight, real, unfiltered sunlight, poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating a city that looked different from this height. For Jane Holland, the skyline was no longer a collection of shadows to hide in, but a map of possibilities. She sat in a deep leather armchair, her posture relaxed yet attentive. She was no longer wearing the starched white button-down of a servant or the black skirt of a girl waiting for her life to end. She wore a tailored charcoal suit that moved like water, a quiet armor for a woman who had reclaimed her name. On the mahogany desk before her lay a single official-looking document, a full legal exoneration signed by the state's attorney and witnessed by the city's highest judicial powers. The framing scandal that had haunted her for 3 years had been dismantled as thoroughly as the Grand Cru estate. Across from her, Jae Young sat on the edge of his desk, his burgundy jacket discarded, his tie loosened. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes a testament to the war they had just finished, but there was a new, vibrant energy in the way he watched her. He reached out and pushed a crystal glass toward her, not a wine glass, but a tumbler of the same amber whiskey they had shared in the Vaughn. "The Duca assets have been seized or absorbed," Jae Young said, his voice a low, appreciative rumble. "The city's water supply has been cleared of all trace elements, and as of 10 minutes ago, the Sommelier Guild has issued a formal apology for the administrative error regarding your credentials." Jane traced the rim of her glass, her eyes catching her reflection. The haunted look was gone, replaced by the sharp, clinical light of a strategist who had found her purpose. "An apology won't fix the vineyards they poisoned, Jae Young, but it's a start." "It's more than a start," he replied, leaning forward until he was within her personal space. "The board of directors for my legitimate holdings had a meeting this morning. They were impressed by the internal audit that caught the Section G leak. They want to meet the woman who outmaneuvered a New York syndicate with a copper penny and a sense of smell." Jane took a slow sip of the whiskey, the burn of the alcohol steadying her. "And what did you tell them?"
"I told them she wasn't for sale," Jae Young said, his blue eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made the air in the room feel thin. "I told them she's my most lethal asset, my strategist, my partner." The word partner hung in the air, weighted with a new kind of power. Jane didn't flinch. She had spent years being invisible, a ghost in the machinery of other people's greed. Now she was the one holding the levers. She reached into a leather portfolio and pulled out a new shipping manifest, one she had spent the morning analyzing. "The waterfront development," Jane said, sliding the paper toward him.
You have a loophole in the logistics of the construction materials. The limestone you're importing from the coast, it's too porous. It'll lead to structural instability in 10 years. But more importantly, the supplier is a shell company for a remnant Duca faction in Jersey. Jae Young took the paper, his fingers brushing hers. The touch sent a jolt through her, a reminder of the heat they had survived together in the fermentation tanks. He looked at the manifest, a genuine, sharp smile spreading across his face. I pay 10 consultants $1 million a year to catch things like that, he murmured, his thumb tracing the line she had highlighted, and you found it before your second drink. You get what you pay for, Jane replied, a touch of wit returning to her voice. Jae Young stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the empire they were now building together. He turned back to her, the light of the morning sun framing his broad shoulders. They still fear the name Moretti, he said softly, but soon they're going to realize that the man in the burgundy suit isn't the one they should be watching. It's the woman standing beside him. Jane stood up, moving to the window to join him. She looked at the city below, no longer a victim of its whims, but a master of its complexities. She wasn't just a taster of wine anymore. She was a taster of power. And as she looked at Jae Young, she realized the vintage they were about to create would be the most intoxicating the city had ever seen. Let them watch, Jane said, her voice a promise of the fire to come. I've always performed better in the spotlight.